I never imagined buying my first home would make my parents treat me like a stranger. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 12 years, I worked as a financial analyst in Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't born into money. I wasn't lucky. Everything I had came from long hours, skipped vacations, and saying no to things my friends enjoyed. While everyone else upgraded their cars every few years, I drove the same old sedan that rattled every winter. While my coworkers booked beach vacations, I stayed home and worked overtime whenever I could. Every extra dollar went into one account, my house fund. There were nights when I wondered if all the sacrifice was worth it. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, my real estate agent called. "Ethan," she said, "your offer was accepted." I pulled my car over because my hands were shaking too much to drive. After years of saving, it finally happened. The house wasn't huge. It had 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, an old maple tree in front, and a porch where I imagined drinking coffee every morning. It wasn't perfect. It was mine. Or at least, it was about to be. I signed every document carefully. The mortgage was only in my name. The deed listed only one owner, me. That detail would become far more important than I realized. I decided not to tell anyone until everything officially closed. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I'd learned something about my family over the years. Good news somehow always became their opportunity. Growing up, my parents believed every decision I made belonged to the entire family. When I chose accounting instead of joining Dad's construction business, they acted like I had betrayed them. When I rented my own apartment instead of staying at home until marriage, Mom cried for 2 weeks and told every relative I had abandoned her. Whenever I bought something nice, Dad asked how much it cost before saying congratulations. Whenever I earned a promotion, Mom immediately started talking about what my younger brother, Kyle, needed. Kyle was 31. He had changed jobs 7 times in 10 years. Every failure somehow became someone else's fault. If he missed rent, my parents helped him. If he bought another expensive truck he couldn't afford, my parents defended him. If I succeeded, they reminded me to stay humble. I told myself buying this house would be different. I was wrong. The closing happened on a Friday morning. That evening, I stood alone in my empty living room. The walls still smelled like fresh paint. Sunlight came through the front windows. I sat on the floor with a slice of takeout pizza and smiled like an idiot. For the first time in my life, I felt completely independent. The next morning, I called my parents. "I have some news," I said. Mom sounded excited. "Are you finally getting married?" I laughed. "No." "Did you get promoted again?" "No." "Then what?" "I bought a house." There was silence. Not happy silence. The kind that makes your stomach tighten. Dad spoke first. "You bought a house?" "Yeah." "When did you decide this?" "I've been saving for years." "I know you've been saving," he said. "I'm asking when you decided." "A few months ago." "And you never thought to discuss it with us?" His voice wasn't curious. It was angry. I didn't think I needed permission. Mom jumped in immediately. "It isn't about permission, Ethan. Families make important decisions together." I looked around my empty living room. I already signed everything. Another long silence. Then Dad asked the question that changed everything. "How many bedrooms?" "3. That was it. Not congratulations. Not we're proud of you. Just 3. By Sunday afternoon, they insisted on seeing the house. I wanted to believe they were finally happy for me, so I invited them over. Kyle came too. The moment they walked inside, Mom didn't compliment anything. She didn't notice the hardwood floors. She didn't mention the kitchen. She looked around like someone inspecting a hotel room. Dad walked from room to room without smiling. Kyle opened closets and laughed. "This room's bigger than my apartment." I smiled politely. "Yeah, I guess." Then Mom stood inside the largest guest bedroom. "This would be perfect." I thought she meant for visitors. "It'll make a nice guest room." She looked confused. "Guest room?" "Yeah." She exchanged a glance with Dad. One glance. One silent conversation. Then Dad sighed. "Ethan." His tone instantly made me nervous. "We assumed this room would be Kyle's." I stared at him. "I'm sorry, what?" Kyle shrugged like this had already been settled. "You've got plenty of space." I laughed because I honestly thought they were joking. Nobody laughed back. Dad folded his arms. "Your brother needs a fresh start." Mom nodded. "His lease ends next month." I blinked. "What does that have to do with my house?" Dad answered without hesitation. "We figured he'd move in here." I felt my heartbeat speeding up. "You figured?" Mom smiled as if she were explaining something obvious. "Well, yes. You have 3 bedrooms. Kyle is family, and you'll be happier having someone here. I looked at Kyle. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't surprised. He was already walking through the hallway like he lived there. Then he pointed toward the garage. I can probably fit my truck in here. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a request. They had already planned his future inside my home without saying a single word to me. I took a slow breath. I never offered that. Dad frowned. You shouldn't have to. What does that mean? It means family helps family. I looked him straight in the eyes. I've helped Kyle for years. I had loaned him money. I had paid overdue bills. I had even helped him prepare for job interviews. None of it lasted. Now they expected me to hand over part of the biggest purchase of my life. When I quietly said, no, the room became completely silent. Mom's smile disappeared. Kyle stopped walking. Dad's face turned red. Then Mom said something so unbelievable that I realized buying this house wasn't the real reason they were angry. They had been planning something much bigger all along. Mom crossed her arms and looked at me as if I had embarrassed her. I can't believe you're acting like this, she said quietly. I took a deep breath. Acting like what? Selfish. That word hit harder than I expected. Not because it was true, because I'd heard it my entire life whenever. I refused to solve one of Kyle's problems. Dad stepped forward. We've spent weeks talking about this. I frowned. Weeks? Mom nodded. Ever since you mentioned your savings were getting close. I stared at all 3 of them. You planned for Kyle to move into a house that I hadn't even bought yet. Kyle rolled his eyes. Come on, Ethan. Don't make it sound weird. It is weird. Dad pointed around the living room. Look at all this space. It's my space. It's family space. No, I answered calmly. It's legally my house. The room became painfully quiet. Then Kyle laughed. You're really going to pull the legal card? I looked at him. I'm pulling the ownership card. He shook his head. I knew you'd change once you had money. Money. That word almost made me laugh. They had no idea how many nights I'd eaten instant noodles because I refused to touch my savings. They never saw the weekends I worked instead of relaxing. They never saw me fixing my own car because I couldn't justify paying a mechanic. But somehow, I was the selfish one. Dad finally spoke again. So what exactly is your plan? My plan. You expect your own brother to struggle while you live in this big house alone? I answered honestly. My plan is to enjoy the home I spent 12 years earning. Mom looked genuinely offended. 12 years. Yes. We raised you. I blinked. What does that have to do with this? If it wasn't for us, she said, you wouldn't even have a career. I couldn't believe where the conversation was going. So because you raised me, Kyle gets a bedroom? Nobody answered. Because deep down, they all knew how ridiculous that sounded. After another uncomfortable minute, they finally left. Or at least, I thought they had. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Kyle. Forgot something. Open the garage. I replied. What? A picture appeared. His truck. Parked outside my driveway. Then another message. I'll start bringing boxes over tonight. I stared at the screen. He wasn't asking. He genuinely believed he'd already moved in. I walked outside. Kyle was standing beside his truck with 2 friends. The truck bed was filled with moving boxes. He smiled. There you are. What are you doing? He looked confused. Moving. I told you no. You weren't serious. I've never been more serious. His smile slowly disappeared. Dude, no. Mom said. I don't care what Mom said. Dad agreed. I don't care what Dad agreed. This is family. This is trespassing. One of his friends quietly backed away. The other pretended to check his phone. Kyle's confidence started fading. You'd actually call the police on me? If you start unloading those boxes. Yes. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he muttered something under his breath, climbed back into his truck, and drove away. I wish that had been the end. It wasn't even close. That evening my phone exploded. My aunt called first. Ethan, your mother is crying. I know. You really won't help your brother? I've helped him for years. This is different. How? Silence. Then, he's family. The same sentence. Again. By Monday morning, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were sending messages. You're breaking your mother's heart. Family comes first. 1 bedroom isn't a big deal. Nobody asked my side. They only heard theirs. Then something strange happened. An older cousin named Melissa called me privately. Ethan. Her voice sounded nervous. I probably shouldn't tell you this. My stomach tightened. What? I overheard your parents talking after Grandma's birthday dinner last month. What did they say? She hesitated. They weren't planning for Kyle to stay there temporarily. I felt cold. What do you mean? They were talking about making your house the family's permanent house. I didn't understand. Melissa continued. Your parents planned to sell their place after retiring. So, they expected to move into your house. I stood completely still. They what? They figured Kyle would already be living there with his future family. My mind raced. So all three of them? Eventually, I leaned against the kitchen counter. It suddenly made sense. The 3 bedrooms. Dad inspecting every room. Mom calling it family space. Kyle acting like he'd already chosen the garage. This had never been about 1 bedroom. They had already designed an entire future. Without asking me once, Melissa lowered her voice. There's something else. What? I heard your dad say your name would stay on the mortgage because your credit was better. I almost dropped the phone. What? They thought you'd keep paying while everyone lived there. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. I had spent 12 years sacrificing everything, and their long-term plan was for me to finance a house I'd barely be allowed to call my own. I thanked Melissa and ended the call. Then I sat in complete silence. I wasn't angry anymore. I was disappointed, because for the first time, I realized my parents had never celebrated my success. They had simply waited for the moment they could use it. That afternoon, Mom called. Her voice was unusually cheerful. I've been thinking. I'll bet. We should all sit down tonight. Why? So we can discuss everyone's responsibilities. Responsibilities? Once Kyle moves in. I interrupted her. Kyle isn't moving in. She ignored me. We'll need to divide groceries and utilities. There it was. Not a request. A household budget. For people who didn't even live there. I said quietly. Mom. What? I know. She paused. Know what? I know about the retirement plan. Silence. Real silence. Then I added. And I know. Dad planned for me to keep paying the mortgage while all of you lived there. Another long pause. When she finally spoke, her voice had completely changed. Who told you that? I didn't answer. Because at that moment, I realized something even more important. If they had planned this for months, there was probably evidence. And if I could prove exactly what they intended, their entire story would fall apart. I didn't answer my mother's question. Instead, I ended the call. For the first time since buying the house, I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking logically. I worked in finance. Facts mattered. Records mattered. If my parents wanted to tell the family that I was selfish, I couldn't stop them. But if they had already made plans behind my back, I wanted proof. Not for revenge. For the truth. The next morning, Melissa called again. I found something, she whispered. What do you mean? My mom accidentally sent me screenshots from the family group chat instead of her book club. My heart skipped a beat. What screenshots? They're from a group chat you're not in. She forwarded them. I opened the first image. Dad had written, once Ethan closes on the house, Kyle can move into the upstairs bedroom. Another message from Mom read, after we retire, we'll sell our place. Ethan won't say no once we're already living there. Then Kyle replied, perfect. I'll finally be able to save money. I stared at the screen. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was their plan, written in black and white. Melissa sighed. I'm sorry. So am I. Not because of the messages. Because they confirmed something I'd spent years refusing to believe. My parents never saw me as my own person. They saw me as the reliable one. The one who earned. The one who sacrificed. The one who would always give in. They were wrong. A few days later, Dad invited me to dinner. Let's settle this like adults. Against my better judgment, I went. The moment I walked in, I realized it wasn't a family dinner. My aunt, uncle, 2 cousins, and even Kyle were there. An intervention. Dad stood up. Ethan, everyone is concerned. Concerned. Interesting choice of words. Mom dabbed her eyes with a tissue. I don't recognize my son anymore. Several relatives nodded. Then Dad looked around the room. Tell everyone why you're refusing to help your brother. Before I could answer, Kyle jumped in. He has 3 empty bedrooms. Someone muttered, that's cold. I let them talk. Every accusation. Every insult. Every disappointed look. Then Dad finally asked, do you have anything to say? I reached into my folder. Actually, I do. I placed printed screenshots on the table. Nobody moved. Dad frowned. What is this? Read them. Mom's face turned pale before she even picked one up. Kyle grabbed another. His smile disappeared instantly. The room fell silent. My aunt looked back and forth between the pages. You planned this. Before Ethan even bought the house. Nobody answered. She read another message aloud. He won't say no once we're already living there. Her eyes slowly lifted toward my parents. You actually wrote this? Mom tried to explain. That's not what it looks like. It looks exactly like what it says, my uncle replied. Dad cleared his throat. We were only discussing possibilities. I calmly slid another page across the table. This one, it was the message about selling their house and letting me keep paying the mortgage. Nobody defended them, because nobody could. For years, I had been painted as the selfish son. In less than 5 minutes, the story changed. Relatives who had criticized me now looked embarrassed. One cousin quietly apologized. I didn't know. I know, I answered. You only heard one side. Carl suddenly slammed his hand on the table. So what? Families help each other. I looked at him. I've helped you for almost 15 years. I reminded everyone about the rent I'd paid, the credit card debt I'd covered, the job interviews I'd arranged, the car repair I'd paid for after he'd promised to reimburse me. He never paid me back. Kyle looked away. I continued. I wasn't saying no because I hate my family. I was saying no because helping had turned into being expected to sacrifice my own future. Nobody argued, because everyone knew it was true. A week later, something unexpected happened. Dad came to my house alone. No mom, no Kyle, no speech. He stood on my porch holding a small box. I found these. Inside were childhood photos, baseball games, fishing trips, birthday parties. He looked older than I remembered. I thought reminding you of these memories might help. I looked through the pictures. They're good memories. They are. But memories don't erase choices. He nodded slowly. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly admitted, we depended on you too much. It wasn't a perfect apology. He never actually said the words, I'm sorry. But it was the closest he'd ever come. I can't fix everything, he said. No, I replied. But you can stop expecting me to. He lowered his head. I'll talk to your mother. And Kyle. Dad gave a tired smile. It's time he learns to solve his own problems. Months passed. Kyle rented a small apartment with a roommate. Not because someone rescued him. Because he finally had no other choice. To everyone's surprise, he kept the same job. He started paying his own bills. He wasn't thrilled about it. But he did it. My parents eventually stopped bringing up the house. They also stopped giving relatives half the story. Family gatherings became quieter. More respectful. Not perfect. Just honest. As for me, I planted flowers around the old maple tree in the front yard. I painted the guest rooms. One became a home office. The other became exactly what I wanted it to be. A guest room. Not a permanent bedroom. A place where people were welcome after they were invited. Sometimes I sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee and think about everything that happened. Buying a house taught me far more than mortgages and paperwork. It taught me that boundaries aren't selfish. They're necessary. The people who truly love you may not always like your boundaries, but they'll eventually learn to respect them. The ones who only valued what you could give them usually walk away. And sometimes, that's the greatest gift of all. If you've ever had someone treat your success like it belonged to them, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story.